The foreclosure notice fluttered against the broken mailbox of the old Whitman farmhouse, 30 miles outside Cedar Falls. Martha, 78, with trembling hands from her Parkinson's, watched the sheriff's car disappear down the gravel road. Beside her, Harold adjusted his oxygen tank. The lung cancer had given them 6 months, maybe less. Their life savings gone to medical bills, their family home seized by creditors. Even their own son had emptied their remaining accounts before vanishing. But Harold squeezed Martha's hand with surprising strength. "Remember Budapest, 1963? He whispered. Martha's clouded eyes suddenly sharpened. For 57 years they'd been Harold and Martha Whitman, retired teachers from Iowa. But before that, before they disappeared into suburban anonymity, they were someone else entirely. Someone the world had been looking for since the Cold War. In that musty basement, surrounded by boxes of forgotten memories, they began building something that would either save them or destroy everything they'd protected for half a century. The question wasn't whether they still had the skills, it was whether the world was ready for what they'd hidden all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The farmhouse groaned around them as they stood in the doorway, studying the basement's shadowed corners. Dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. Harold's breathing was labored, each exhale a reminder of borrowed time, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. "The foundation is solid," Martha observed, her teacher's voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She descended the wooden steps carefully, testing each board. Cedar post-construction, built to last. Harold followed, dragging his oxygen tank with practiced ease. At the bottom, he knelt beside a particular stone in the foundation wall, pressing until it shifted. Behind it lay a metal box, untouched for decades. "I never thought we'd need this again," Martha said, watching him extract yellow documents and a small leather journal. "Neither did I." Harold's fingers traced the Cyrillic letters on the journal's cover. But Michael changed everything. Their son's betrayal still stung. Not just the stolen money, but the cruel words he'd spat before disappearing. Worthless old fools living off Social Security. If only he knew what his parents had accomplished before he was born, the secrets they'd buried to give him a normal life. Martha picked up one of the documents, squinting at the faded ink. "Project Nightingale. I haven't seen this designation in," she paused, calculating, "59 years. "The skills don't fade," Harold said, opening the journal. Page after page revealed technical diagrams, chemical formulas, and encrypted notes in multiple languages, like riding a bicycle. They spent the afternoon cataloging what they'd need. The basement's electrical system required updating, but the bones were good. Harold's engineering background, the real one, not the fabricated teaching credentials they'd used for cover, came flooding back as he examined the space. "We'll need privacy," Martha said, measuring distances with her eyes. "Soundproofing, and the ventilation system will be critical. I can handle that. Question is, do we still have contacts?" Martha smiled for the first time in weeks. "Dead drops don't disappear just because you stop using them. Some things never change." As evening approached, they sat on upturned crates, sharing cold soup from a can. The house had no power yet, and they'd used most of their remaining $847 on basic supplies. But something had shifted between them. The defeated elderly couple who'd watched their life crumble that morning was gone, replaced by something sharper, more dangerous. "The irony is perfect," Harold mused, adjusting his oxygen flow. "Everyone expects old people to be invisible, harmless. They won't see us coming. The question is what we do with it once it's finished," Martha said. "We built it once for ideology. This time it's survival." Harold's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard in decades, and maybe a little payback. Outside, a car's engine echoed across the fields, probably just a neighbor, but both of them tensed instinctively. Old habits die hard. "We start tomorrow," Harold decided. 6 months isn't much time. Martha nodded, then hesitated. Harold, what we're planning to build down here, it won't just change our situation. Once word gets out. I know. He met her gaze steadily. But what's the alternative? Die quietly in some state nursing home while Michael drinks away our legacy? She considered this, then smiled with grim determination. Budapest was fun while it lasted. This will be better. We're not 25 anymore, answering to handlers and government bureaucrats. This time, we set the terms. As darkness settled over the farmhouse, they climbed the basement stairs together. Tomorrow, they would begin transforming the forgotten space below into something that would remind the world why certain names from the Cold War had never been found. The old couple from Iowa was about to become very dangerous again. The farmhouse crouched against the horizon like a wounded animal, its weathered clapboard siding the color of old bones. Martha pressed her face to the passenger window as Harold's ancient Buick crunched up the gravel drive, weeds scraping the undercarriage with skeletal fingers. 3 broken shutters hung at drunken angles, and the front porch sagged like a mouth missing teeth. "Well," Harold said, his voice carefully neutral, "it's got character." Martha almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. Character. That's what real estate agents called decay when they were trying to be kind. The listing had been honest enough. Needs work, estate sale, cash only. But seeing it now, she wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. They sat in the car for a long moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything they couldn't say. 6 months ago, they'd lived in a modest ranch house with a manicured lawn and neighbors who brought casseroles when Harold had his surgery. Now those neighbors probably whispered about them over their coffee, shaking their heads at how quickly people could fall. "The bones are good," Martha said finally, surprising herself. She'd been thinking about bones a lot lately. Harold's, growing more prominent each day, her own aching in the morning cold. But the house did have good bones, solid foundation, straight roof lines despite the cosmetic damage. And look at that land. 47 acres rolled away from the house in gentle swells, most of it overgrown with prairie grass and volunteer trees. A barn squatted in the distance, red paint faded to the color of dried blood. To the east, she could make out the glint of water, a pond maybe, or a creek. It was isolated, certainly. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles down a county road that seemed to exist more as a suggestion than an actual thoroughfare. Harold pulled the keys from the ignition, a single brass key on a ring with a faded John Deere fob. "Ready?" The front door stuck, swollen with decades of humidity and neglect. When it finally gave way, it opened onto a living room that time had treated unkindly. Wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing patches of horsehair plaster underneath. The wooden floors were scarred but solid, and afternoon light streamed through windows that were dirty but intact. They moved through the house like archaeologists, cataloguing damage and possibility in equal measure. The kitchen was a monument to 1960s optimism, avocado green appliances and Formica countertops with boomerang patterns. Most of it worked, after a fashion. The refrigerator hummed to life when Harold plugged it in, and the tap coughed up rust-colored water that gradually ran clear. "Septic's probably shot," Harold muttered, testing a faucet. "And God knows what the wiring looks like." But Martha was already seeing past the problems, her mind working in ways it hadn't for months. The kitchen could be painted, the floors refinished, the windows just needed soap and elbow grease. She'd always been good at seeing potential, in houses, in people, in situations that others might write off as hopeless. The bedrooms upstairs were small but serviceable, with slanted ceilings that spoke of the house's age. They'd take the front bedroom with its view of the pond. Harold would like watching the water in the evenings. It was when they descended to the basement that Martha felt something shift inside her chest. The space was larger than she'd expected, with a concrete floor and stone walls that spoke of serious construction. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows that seemed to dance in the corners. The air smelled of earth and possibilities. "Flood damage," Harold said, pointing to a waterline about 18 inches up the wall. But Martha saw something else. The basement was divided into 3 rooms, one large central space and 2 smaller areas that might have been root cellars or storage rooms. The walls were thick, the ceiling solid. Most importantly, it was private, hidden. The kind of space where a person could work without interruption, without questions, without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down like a stone. "It's perfect," she said. Harold looked at her strangely. Perfect for what? She didn't answer immediately. Couldn't, really, because the ideas forming in her head were still too fragile for words. But standing there in the dim light, surrounded by walls that had held their secrets for decades, Martha felt something she hadn't experienced since the doctor had delivered Harold's diagnosis: hope. "For starting over," she said finally. They climbed the stairs in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the overgrown fields in shades of gold and amber. Tomorrow, they'd start the work of making this place livable. Tonight, they'd sleep in a motel in town and count what remained of their money. $847. It should have felt like nothing. Instead, as Martha looked back at the house, their house, it felt like the beginning of everything. The basement stairs creaked under Harold's weight as he descended into the musty darkness. Martha close behind, with a battery-powered lantern casting dancing shadows on the cracked concrete walls. The smell hit them first, decades of dampness, mouse droppings, and something else, something organic that had been sealed away for too long. "Jesus," Harold muttered, sweeping cobwebs from his face. "When's the last time anyone was down here?" Martha raised the lantern higher, illuminating a space larger than they'd expected. The ceiling was low, maybe 7 feet, supported by thick wooden beams that looked solid despite their age. Water stains mapped the walls like continents, and in one corner, a rust-stained utility sink sat beneath a tangle of old pipes. "Look at this," Martha said, moving toward the far wall. Her voice echoed strangely in the enclosed space. "There's electrical down here. Old, but it might still work." Harold followed the beam of light to where she pointed. A metal electrical panel hung askew, its door hanging open to reveal a nest of cloth-wrapped wires. "Knob and tube," he said, running his fingers along the ceramic insulators. "Haven't seen this in 40 years. They spent the next hour exploring their inheritance. The basement ran the length of the house above, roughly 30 by 20 feet. In addition to the utility sink, they found the remains of what might have been a workshop, a heavy wooden workbench against one wall, its surface scarred by decades of use. Shelves lined another wall, empty except for a few mason jars clouded with age. "The foundation's solid," Harold observed, tapping the stone walls. "Fieldstone. They built things to last back then." Martha was examining the floor, sweeping away years of debris with her foot. "Harold, look at this." She knelt despite her arthritic knees, brushing away more dirt. "This isn't the original floor." He joined her, the lantern revealing what she'd discovered. Beneath the grime lay newer concrete, a section perhaps 8 feet square that was clearly a different color and texture from the rest. "Someone poured this later," he said. "Much later, by the look of it. Why would they do that?" Harold stood, his back protesting. Could be anything. Busted pipe, foundation repair. But even as he said it, something about the placement bothered him. It was too central, too deliberate. They climbed back upstairs as afternoon light slanted through the kitchen windows. Martha set the lantern on the counter and looked at her husband. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we've got a roof over our heads and a space nobody's going to bother us in." Harold pulled out one of the rickety chairs and sat heavily. "Question is, what do we do with it?" Martha poured herself a glass of water from the tap, surprised when it ran clear after a few seconds of rust-colored sputtering. "You remember what you used to say about problems? How every problem was just an opportunity wearing work clothes? That was before our son decided to steal our life savings." "No." Her voice was sharp. "That was when we still had things to lose. Now we've got nothing left but time, and not much of that if the doctors are right." Harold looked at his wife of 52 years, seeing something in her expression that reminded him of the woman he'd married, the one who'd talked him into starting his own business when everyone said they were crazy, the one who'd mortgaged their house to keep the company afloat during the recession of '91. "What are you suggesting?" Martha sat across from him, her weathered hands flat on the scarred table. "I'm suggesting that maybe losing everything was the best thing that could have happened to us." "Martha." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a crow cawed from somewhere in the overgrown orchard, the workshop in the basement. "I could clean it up, get some tools." "We've got 6 months, Harold. Maybe a little more if we're lucky. The question is, do we want to spend it feeling sorry for ourselves, or do we want to remind the world who we used to be?" He reached across the table and took her hand. Her skin was thin as paper now, mapped with liver spots and scars from a lifetime of work, but her grip was still strong. "What did you have in mind?" Martha smiled, and for a moment he could see the young woman who'd stood beside him at the altar in 1971. "I have no idea, but I think that basement is going to help us figure it out." As evening settled over the farmhouse, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the old house settling around them and planning for tomorrow. The silence in the basement was broken only by the soft hum of the ancient furnace and Martha's measured breathing as she worked. 3 weeks had passed since they'd arrived at the farmhouse, and Harold had grown accustomed to the sound of her footsteps on the wooden stairs at odd hours, sometimes at 2 in the morning, sometimes before dawn. He stood at the top of the basement stairs now, watching her bent form illuminated by the harsh light of a work lamp she'd purchased during one of her mysterious trips to town. The concrete floor was covered with what looked like laboratory equipment: glass beakers, metal stands, heating elements, and rows of small bottles filled with various colored liquids. "Martha," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, her reading glasses reflecting the lamplight. "Come down, Harold. I think it's time." The basement felt different than it had when they'd first explored it. Martha had cleared away decades of accumulated junk, revealing a surprisingly spacious room with good ventilation and solid workbenches along 2 walls. What struck Harold most was how organized everything appeared, how purposeful. "What is all this?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would change everything. Martha straightened, removing her glasses and cleaning them with a cloth. "Sit down, dear." She gestured to an old kitchen chair she'd brought down from upstairs. "I need to tell you something I should have shared 40 years ago." Harold remained standing, his eyes scanning the equipment. Some of it looked familiar from his high school chemistry classes, but other devices were more sophisticated, almost pharmaceutical in nature. "Martha, what have you been doing down here?" "Before I met you," she began, her voice steady but softer than usual, "I worked for a chemical company in Detroit, Morrison and Associates. They specialized in agricultural compounds, pesticides, fertilizers, growth inhibitors." She paused, watching his face. "I was their lead chemist." Harold felt the words hit him like a physical blow. In 43 years of marriage, Martha had never mentioned any career beyond the secretarial work she'd done occasionally when money was tight. "I don't understand. Why didn't you ever—" "Because I was good at it, Harold. Too good." She moved to one of the workbenches and picked up a small vial filled with clear liquid. "I developed compounds that could do things the company hadn't asked for, things they couldn't legally market." The basement seemed to grow smaller around him. "What kind of things?" Martha set down the vial and turned to face him fully. "The cancer treatments that bankrupted us. They're variations of compounds I created 30 years before the pharmaceutical companies discovered them. The medications that kept us alive cost $8,000 a month because the patents were held by corporations who bought the formulas from companies like Morrison." Harold's legs suddenly felt weak and he sank into the chair. "You invented cancer drugs?" "Among other things." She gestured to the equipment around them. "I kept my notes, my formulas, my equipment. Morrison let me go when I refused to sign over the rights to my personal research. They couldn't force me to hand over work I'd done on my own time, but they made sure I couldn't work in the field again." "Why are you telling me this now?" Martha walked to a filing cabinet Harold hadn't noticed before, one that looked far newer than anything else in the basement. She withdrew a thick folder and placed it on the workbench between them. Because David's betrayal gave us an opportunity. We have nothing left to lose, which means we have everything to gain. Harold opened the folder, finding pages of chemical formulas, molecular diagrams, and what appeared to be manufacturing instructions. Martha, this is worth approximately $50 million on the legitimate market, she finished. Worth considerably more if we're willing to be creative about our distribution methods. The implications crashed over him in waves. You want us to manufacture drugs illegally? I want us to survive, Harold. More than that, I want us to matter. Her voice carried a steel he'd rarely heard before. Do you know how many people die because they can't afford medications I developed? How many families lose everything the way we did? Harold looked around the basement again, seeing it now with new eyes. This wasn't a desperate elderly woman's final project. This was a sophisticated operation being set up by someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The equipment, he said slowly. How long have you been planning this? I ordered it 2 days after David cleaned out our accounts, Martha admitted. I've been corresponding with certain individuals who have distribution networks the pharmaceutical companies can't access. People who serve markets that have been abandoned by legitimate medicine. Harold stood up, his mind reeling. This could get us arrested, or worse. Martha smiled then, and Harold saw something in her expression he'd never seen before, a cold intelligence that seemed to transform her face entirely. Harold, she said quietly, at our age, what's the worst they can really do to us? The notification sound from Harold's laptop cut through the silence like a blade. Martha looked up from her notebook where she'd been sketching modifications to their design, her pencil hovering over calculations that would have impressed her old engineering professors. Another deposit, Harold said, his voice carrying a mixture of disbelief and something darker. 12,000 this time. Martha set down her pencil and moved to peer over his shoulder at the screen. The anonymous cryptocurrency transaction glowed against the dark web interface they'd learned to navigate with surprising ease. Their client list had grown from desperate whispers on obscure forums to a steady stream of requests that made her stomach clench. From where? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. Harold's fingers moved across the keyboard with the dexterity of someone who'd spent 40 years fixing delicate machinery. The trace came back within minutes. Phoenix. Looks like a assisted living facilities network. Martha closed her eyes. She knew what that meant. Another family facing the same impossible choice they'd confronted, watching their savings evaporate while their loved ones suffered. The irony wasn't lost on her that their solution to one kind of desperation was feeding another. The basement had transformed over the past month. What had begun as crude experiments with Harold's pill press and Martha's chemistry knowledge had evolved into something that resembled a pharmaceutical operation. Clean surfaces, precise measurements, quality control protocols that Martha remembered from her brief stint consulting for a drug company decades ago. They'd started with simple pain medication, oxycodone tablets that sold for 10 cents on the dollar compared to pharmacy prices. Harold's mechanical genius had modified the pill press to create tablets virtually indistinguishable from the originals. Martha's forgotten knowledge of organic chemistry, rusty but still functional, had guided them through the process of working with raw materials ordered from overseas suppliers who asked no questions. But their clientele had pushed them toward darker territories. "Show me the request," Martha said, settling into the folding chair they'd brought down from upstairs. Harold clicked through to their encrypted message system. The latest inquiry was like so many others, clinical in its desperation, heartbreaking in its necessity. A daughter in Phoenix, watching her father waste away from late-stage cancer while insurance companies denied claims and doctors prescribed inadequate dosages out of fear of regulatory scrutiny. She wants enough for... Harold's voice trailed off as he read. For when the pain becomes too much. Martha understood. Not pain medication this time. Something else, something final. They sat in silence, surrounded by the humming of equipment they'd never imagined owning. processing a request they'd never imagined receiving. The line they'd crossed seemed clear in retrospect, but Martha couldn't pinpoint exactly when they'd stepped over it. Was it the first time they'd synthesized something stronger than what she found in their medicine cabinet? When they'd accepted money from strangers? When Harold had suggested they could help people the system had abandoned? "We could say no," Harold offered quietly. Martha looked around their operation. Professional-grade scales ordered with cryptocurrency. A fume hood Harold had built from plans he'd found online, chemicals that would raise red flags if purchased by anyone less invisible than two dying senior citizens in the middle of nowhere. They'd built something that worked, something that helped people, something that would probably get them life sentences if anyone discovered it. "Her father is 83, Martha said, reading over the message again. "Pancreatic cancer, Medicare denial, no savings left. I know. If we don't help her, she'll find someone else. Someone who doesn't care about purity or dosage or making sure she understands exactly what she's getting." Harold nodded slowly. They both knew the dark web was full of people willing to take advantage of desperation. Their operation was different, careful, compassionate, professional. They tested everything. They provided detailed instructions. They refused to sell anything recreational, anything that fed addiction rather than alleviating genuine suffering. But those distinctions felt thinner each day. Martha's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Reeves' office, reminding her about Harold's appointment next week. The appointment where they'd learn whether the treatments were working, whether they had weeks or months, whether any of this desperate venture would matter in the end. "Accept the order," she said finally. "But we do this one differently." Harold raised an eyebrow. "No money," Martha continued, "and we include a letter. Tell her about hospice options, about patient advocacy groups, about fighting the insurance denial. Give her alternatives. And if she still wants, then we help her make sure her father doesn't suffer." Harold's fingers moved to the keyboard, beginning to type their response. Martha returned to her notebook, but instead of chemical formulas, she found herself writing a letter to a daughter in Phoenix, trying to find words that might offer hope while preparing for its absence. Above them, the farmhouse creaked in the wind, keeping their secrets. The basement smelled of sawdust and something chemical that Martha couldn't quite place. Harold had been down there for 3 days straight, emerging only for meals and bathroom breaks, his clothes increasingly stained with substances she didn't recognize. When she asked what he was working on, he'd mutter something about getting organized and disappear again. Martha understood the need for purpose. Since arriving at the farmhouse 2 weeks ago, she'd thrown herself into making the upstairs livable. The kitchen now functioned, mostly, though the ancient refrigerator wheezed like an emphysema patient. She'd scrubbed decades of grime from the windows, letting pale October light filter through rooms that had sat empty since Harold's aunt died 5 years earlier. But Harold's obsession with the basement worried her. She'd ventured down once, finding him hunched over a workbench he'd somehow assembled from scrap lumber, surrounded by boxes he must have retrieved from the barn. When she'd approached, he'd quickly covered whatever he was working on with a paint-stained tarp. "Privacy, Martha," he'd said without looking up. "Everyone needs a project." She'd retreated, stung by the dismissal but recognizing something fragile in his posture. Harold had always been a man who solved problems with his hands. During their early marriage, when money was tight, he'd built most of their furniture, repaired their cars, even rewired their first house. The betrayal by their son David had broken something fundamental in him, not just his heart, but his sense of competence, his belief that he could protect what mattered. Maybe the basement was his way of rebuilding that confidence. Still, the secrecy bothered her. They'd promised each other complete honesty about their situation, their plans, their fears. They had so little time left, according to the doctors. Harold's heart was failing, her own cancer spreading despite the treatments they could no longer afford. Every day was precious, and she didn't want to spend them dancing around unspoken tensions. The sound of footsteps above interrupted her thoughts. Harold was in the kitchen, probably making coffee. She found him at the counter, But instead of his usual disheveled morning appearance, he was clean-shaven and wearing his good khaki pants, clothes she hadn't seen since they'd left the assisted living facility. "Going somewhere?" she asked. He turned, and she was startled by the brightness in his eyes. For weeks, he'd worn the hollow expression of a man watching his life dissolve. Now he looked almost energetic. "Town," he said. "Need supplies." "What kind of supplies?" "We agreed to be careful with the money." Harold poured coffee into 2 chipped mugs they'd found in a cabinet. "Investment supplies." The word hung between them like a challenge. They had $847 to their names. The idea of investing any of it seemed either delusional or dangerous. "Harold, we talked about this. We need to make what we have last." "How long?" His voice was gentle but insistent. "How long exactly should we make it last, Martha?" She couldn't answer because they both knew the truth. The doctors had given Harold 6 months, maybe 8. Her own prognosis was similar. Their money might stretch that long if they were careful, eating beans and rice, keeping the heat low, avoiding any emergencies. But then what? Die broke instead of very broke? "Show me," she said. "Whatever you're doing down there, show me first." Harold studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, but keep an open mind." The basement felt different as she followed him down the wooden stairs, more organized, purposeful. Harold had somehow transformed the cluttered space into something resembling a workshop. The boxes from the barn were neatly arranged along one wall, their contents sorted into smaller containers. The workbench held tools she didn't recognize, and several notebooks filled with Harold's careful handwriting. But it was the corner that made her breath catch. Harold had set up what looked like a chemistry set. Glass vessels, rubber tubing, a small heating element. It reminded her of their grandson's science fair projects, but more sophisticated, more serious. "Harold, what is this?" He pulled the tarp away from the workbench's center, revealing a collection of small glass bottles filled with clear liquid. Each was labeled in his neat printing. Dates, numbers, abbreviations she didn't understand. "Your aunt was a smart woman," he said. "Smarter than anyone knew. I found her journals in those boxes, along with some other things. Recipes, you might call them." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. "Recipes for what?" Harold picked up one of the bottles, holding it to the light. The liquid was perfectly clear, like water, but something about his careful handling suggested it was anything but harmless. "Solutions," he said quietly. "For people with problems money can't solve." The implications hit her slowly, like cold water rising. She looked at the makeshift laboratory. The careful documentation, the secrecy that now made terrible sense. "Harold," she whispered, "what have you done?" The October wind rattled the farmhouse windows as Martha descended the basement stairs, her arthritic hands gripping the railing. 3 weeks had passed since they'd moved in, and what she and Harold had accomplished in that time would have seemed impossible to anyone who knew them as the frail, broken couple who'd lost everything. The basement had been transformed. What once was a dank, cluttered space now hummed with purpose. Harold had rigged LED strips along the ceiling, powered by a car battery he'd salvaged from the barn. The concrete walls were lined with metal shelving units they'd assembled from scrap materials, each shelf holding rows of glass jars filled with various substances in different stages of preparation. Martha moved between the makeshift workstations with practiced efficiency, checking temperatures on improvised heating elements, adjusting timers fashioned from old alarm clocks, and making precise notations in a composition notebook with her careful handwriting. Her chemistry degree from 1962 might have seemed worthless when the bills started piling up, but down here, surrounded by beakers and burners cobbled together from kitchen supplies and hardware store finds, she felt more alive than she had in decades. Harold emerged from behind a partition they'd constructed from old bedsheets, wiping his hands on a rag. His engineering background had proven invaluable in creating the ventilation system that kept the air clear and the work safe. PVC pipes snaked along the ceiling, leading to a fan that exhausted through a hidden vent he'd cut into the foundation. "Batch 17 is ready for testing," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd found his purpose again. Martha nodded, consulting her notebook. The modifications to the alkaline process seemed to be working. "We're getting better yield and faster processing time." She looked up at him, and for a moment, 40 years fell away from both their faces. They were young scientists again, brilliant minds working in tandem toward a common goal. The goal itself had evolved over the weeks. What started as desperate research into their medical conditions had expanded into something far more ambitious. Martha's cancer treatments had given her intimate knowledge of pharmaceutical manufacturing, and Harold's background had taught him to see systems and inefficiencies everywhere. Together, they'd identified an opportunity that existed in the grey spaces between legal and illegal, between moral and immoral. They weren't making anything dangerous or addictive. Instead, they'd focused on creating high-quality alternatives to expensive medications, the very ones that had bankrupted them. The markup on insulin, blood pressure medications, and pain relievers was criminal, they'd decided. Someone with the right knowledge and equipment could produce the same compounds for pennies on the dollar. Martha measured out precise amounts of the latest batch into small vials, each one representing hundreds of dollars in potential savings for people like themselves. They'd started with insulin, Harold having found a way to culture the necessary bacteria using equipment jury-rigged from aquarium supplies and laboratory glassware ordered piecemeal from different suppliers. "We'll need more raw materials soon," Harold said, consulting his own notebook filled with sketches and calculations. "The supplier in Canada hasn't responded to our last inquiry." "I found another source," Martha replied, pulling out a letter that had arrived that morning. "Someone who understands what we're trying to do." The letter was from Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a retired biochemist in Portland who'd been following their discreet inquiries on certain online forums. She'd lost her husband to rationed insulin and understood their motivation. More importantly, she had access to laboratory-grade equipment and chemicals that would improve both their efficiency and their safety margins. Harold read the letter twice, his engineering mind already calculating shipping costs and delivery schedules. "She wants to visit." "Next week," Martha confirmed. "She's driving down from Portland with a van full of equipment. Says she wants to see our setup before committing to a partnership." The word partnership carried weight between them. What they were doing was no longer just about survival, it was about something larger. Every successful batch represented people who wouldn't have to choose between medication and rent, families who wouldn't face the same impossible decisions that had destroyed their retirement and their relationship with their son. Martha climbed the stairs slowly, her body reminding her why they'd started this journey in the first place. The pain in her bones was constant now, a steady drumbeat underlying everything she did. But there was something else, too, a sense of purpose that the pain medications couldn't provide. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, dusting the bare fields that stretched toward the horizon. Winter would bring new challenges, but it would also provide cover for their activities. Fewer visitors, less attention from neighbors who might wonder about the unusual amount of deliveries to the old farmhouse. Harold joined her at the kitchen window, both of them watching the snow accumulate on the windshield of their ancient Honda. They'd come here to die with dignity, but somewhere in that basement laboratory, surrounded by the tools of their former trades, they'd found something else entirely. They'd found a way to fight back. The sound of gravel crunching under tires sent Martha's heart hammering against her ribs. She peered through the kitchen's grimy window, watching a black sedan pull into their driveway. The car looked expensive, official, the kind that carried trouble in its leather seats. "Harold," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the vehicle. "Someone's here." Harold emerged from the basement, wiping his hands on a stained cloth. The chemical smell clung to him like cologne. "I know. I heard them coming up the road." His voice carried an odd calm that Martha had learned to recognize over the past month. It was the same tone he used when discussing their dwindling bank account or the pain medication they could no longer afford. Two men stepped out of the sedan. The driver was young, maybe 30, with the kind of sharp suit that cost more than their monthly grocery budget. The passenger was older, graying at the temples, carrying a leather briefcase that caught the afternoon light. "You think it's about the house?" Martha's fingers found the edge of the kitchen counter, gripping it like an anchor. No. Harold's certainty surprised her. The bank would send different people. "These aren't collectors." The knock came 3 times, measured and professional. Harold walked to the front door without hesitation, and Martha followed, staying a step behind. When he opened the door, both men smiled with practiced politeness. "Mr. Harold Dennison?" the older man asked. "I'm Robert Chen from Meridian Pharmaceuticals. This is my associate, David Walsh. We were hoping we might have a word with you." Martha felt the blood drain from her face. Pharmaceuticals. She caught Harold's eye, but his expression remained neutral, almost bored. "I'm afraid you have the wrong house," Harold said. "We're just trying to get by day to day. Don't have much use for pharmaceutical companies." Chen's smile widened. "Actually, we think you might have more use for us than you realize. We've been tracking some interesting chemical purchases in this area. Small quantities, but the combination caught our attention." He glanced at the briefcase in his hand. "May we come in? I think we have a business proposition that might interest you." Martha's mouth went dry. The basement door was closed, but she imagined she could still smell the sharp, medicinal odors that had become as familiar as breakfast coffee. Harold had been so careful about the purchases, spreading them across different suppliers, different towns. They'd both assumed his background in chemistry would help them avoid exactly this kind of attention. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Harold said, but he stepped aside to let them enter. The 2 men surveyed the sparse living room with its second-hand furniture and water-stained ceiling. Martha wondered what they saw. 2 elderly people playing at being criminals or something more dangerous. Chen set his briefcase on the coffee table and clicked it open. Inside, Martha caught glimpses of documents, photographs, and what looked like chemical formulas. Her stomach twisted. "Mr. Dennison, we know about your background at Morrison Chemical. 23 years as a research chemist before the plant closed. We also know about your current financial situation." Chen's voice remained gentle, but there was steel underneath. "What we're curious about is what you've been doing with methylamine, lithium strips, and pseudoephedrine." Harold sat down slowly in his worn armchair. "Those are common enough chemicals. Could be used for any number of things." True, Walsh spoke for the first time, his voice younger but equally controlled. "But the combination, the quantities, the timing, it suggests a very specific application." Martha remained standing, her hand resting on Harold's shoulder. She could feel the tension in his muscles, coiled tight despite his calm demeanor. "Let me be direct," Chen continued. "We're not here to cause trouble, quite the opposite. We represent certain interests that are always looking for talented chemists with practical experience, people who understand quality control, consistency, proper procedures." The words hung in the air like smoke. Martha understood what they were really saying, and the realization made her knees weak. These weren't law enforcement officers. They weren't here to arrest them. They were here to recruit them. "You're assuming we're manufacturing something illegal," Harold said carefully. "We're assuming you're manufacturing something valuable," Chen corrected. "The question is whether you'd prefer to continue working alone with all the risks that entails, or whether you'd be interested in a partnership with better resources and protection." Martha's grip tightened on Harold's shoulder. 6 months ago, the most dangerous thing in their lives had been Harold's irregular heartbeat. Now they were sitting in their living room, discussing drug manufacturing with corporate representatives, who looked like they'd stepped out of a boardroom. "What kind of partnership?" Harold asked. And Martha knew they'd already crossed a line they could never uncross. Martha's hands trembled as she carefully measured the crystalline powder, her arthritic fingers more precise than they'd been in months. The basement had transformed into something that would have made her old colleagues at the pharmaceutical company both proud and terrified. Glass beakers caught the light from the improvised ventilation system Harold had rigged, creating rainbow patterns on the concrete walls. "Temperatures holding steady," Harold called from his position at the hot plate, his voice carrying the same focused intensity he'd once brought to managing million-dollar construction projects. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here they were, applying decades of legitimate expertise to something that would land them in federal prison if anyone discovered it. Martha wiped her brow with the back of her wrist, careful not to contaminate anything. The batch cooling in the corner represented 3 days of meticulous work, and if her calculations were correct, it would net them more money than Harold's pension had provided in 6 months. The thought should have brought relief, but instead it twisted something deep in her chest. "I keep thinking about Susan Morrison," she said quietly, referring to their neighbor who'd lost her husband to an overdose the previous spring. What would she think if she knew? Harold's jaw tightened. Susan Morrison isn't going to lose her house because her insurance company decided cancer treatments were experimental. He adjusted the heat with practiced precision, and her son isn't living in a mansion built with money stolen from his parents' medical fund. The bitterness in his voice cut through the chemical smell that had become as familiar as morning coffee. Martha understood it, felt it burning in her own throat every time she thought about David's betrayal. But understanding didn't make their current path feel any less like walking along the edge of a cliff. The sound of gravel crunching under tires froze them both. Harold immediately killed the heat and moved to the small window he'd cleared for surveillance. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs as she listened to car doors slamming. 2 men, Harold whispered, his face pale in the artificial light. Not police, too casual. They'd prepared for this possibility. Within 90 seconds, the active equipment was hidden behind false panels Harold had constructed, and the basement looked like nothing more than an old man's workshop. Martha climbed the stairs on shaking legs, Harold close behind her. The knock came 3 times, sharp and impatient. Through the front window, Martha could see 2 men in their 30s, one wearing an expensive leather jacket despite the heat, the other constantly scanning their surroundings. Everything about them screamed danger. Harold Brennan, the man in the leather jacket, smiled when Harold opened the door, but it never reached his eyes. "My name's Vic. I hear you've got something my associates might be interested in." Harold's posture shifted subtly, decades of dealing with difficult contractors serving him well. "I'm afraid you've got the wrong house, son. Nothing here but 2 old folks trying to get by." Vic's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Come on, Harold. Word gets around. High-quality product, pharmaceutical-grade setup. That's not something you see every day around here." Martha felt the world tilting beneath her feet. How had word gotten out so quickly? They'd been so careful, dealing only with Marcus, the young man Harold had met at the diner, who'd seemed desperate enough to be trustworthy. "I think you should leave," Martha said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "We don't know what you're talking about." The second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a subtle accent Martha couldn't place. "Mrs. Brennan, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here to offer a partnership. You've got skills, we've got distribution. Everyone makes money. And if we're not interested in partners?" Harold asked, though Martha could see the fear behind his defiant stance. Vic's smile widened. "Well, that would be unfortunate. See, you've entered a market that operates by certain rules. You can work with us, or you can work against us, but you can't ignore us." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Martha thought about the $3,200 hidden upstairs, their first week's profit that had felt like salvation just hours ago. Now it seemed like evidence of their own naivety. "We'll need time to think," Harold said finally. "Of course." Vic nodded, pulling out a business card that looked suspiciously legitimate. "Take all the time you need. We'll check back tomorrow evening." After the car disappeared down their dirt road, Martha and Harold stood in their kitchen, the weight of their new reality settling around them like a shroud. They'd thought they were solving their problems, but they'd only traded one set of impossible circumstances for another. "What have we done?" Martha whispered. Harold pulled her close, his own hands shaking now. "I don't know, but there's no going back." Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain they desperately needed for their dying garden. The knock came at 3:17 a.m., sharp and insistent against the farmhouse's warped front door. Martha's eyes snapped open in the darkness, her hand instinctively reaching for Harold's shoulder. He was already awake, his breathing controlled but alert. "Sheriff's Department," came the muffled voice through the door. "Need to speak with you folks." Harold swung his legs over the side of their makeshift bed, the old floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Martha followed, pulling her threadbare robe tight against the October chill that seeped through every crack in their temporary sanctuary. "Coming!" Harold called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He caught Martha's eye in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. She nodded once, understanding passing between them like electricity. Deputy Collins stood on their sagging porch, flashlight in hand, his young face grave in the harsh lead glow. Behind him, Martha could make out the silhouette of Sheriff Morrison, a man whose reputation for thoroughness preceded him. "Sorry to disturb you at this hour," Collins said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry at all. "We've had some reports about unusual activity in this area. Mind if we come in?" Harold stepped back, gesturing them inside. "Of course, officers, though I'm not sure what we could tell you. We keep to ourselves mostly." The interior of the farmhouse looked exactly as it should, sparse furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of their remaining possessions stacked in corners, the detritus of lives forcibly simplified. Morrison's experienced eyes swept the space methodically, taking in every detail. "What kind of activity?" Martha asked, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose bones betrayed her daily. "We haven't seen much of anything out here." Morrison pulled out a small notebook. Reports of lights at odd hours, delivery trucks on roads that don't typically see commercial traffic. Unusual sounds. His gaze sharpened. Electronic humming specifically. Electronic humming? Harold's confusion seemed genuine. "Sheriff, look around. We can barely afford to keep the electricity on. What you're hearing is probably just the old refrigerator. Thing's been making noise since the Carter administration." As if summoned, the ancient appliance in the kitchen chose that moment to shudder to life with a mechanical groan that could indeed explain away a multitude of sounds. Collins had wandered toward the back of the house, his flashlight beam dancing across walls and door frames. "What's down there?" he asked, pointing toward the basement door. "Storage mostly," Martha said. "Old furniture, holiday decorations we'll never use again. The steps aren't safe. Harold nearly fell through one last week. Mind if I take a look?" Harold moved to the door, testing the handle with obvious reluctance. It rattled but held firm, afraid it stuck again. Moisture's warped the frame something fierce. "I've been meaning to work on it, but—" he gestured vaguely at his arthritic hands. Morrison approached, studying the door with professional interest. The wood was indeed swollen, paint peeling in long strips that spoke of decades of neglect. When he pushed against it, the door held fast, and the frame creaked ominously. "Looks like it hasn't been opened in months," he observed. "Probably hasn't," Harold agreed. "We moved what we needed up here when we arrived. Everything else can stay put until we figure out our next move." The sheriff's radio crackled to life, dispatch reporting a domestic disturbance 3 counties over. Morrison listened, then looked back at the elderly couple standing in their run-down sanctuary. "You folks having any financial troubles? Beyond the obvious, I mean. Anyone who might want to cause you harm?" Martha's laugh was bitter. "Officer, at our age, with our bank account, the only people who'd want to hurt us are bill collectors. And they've already taken everything worth taking." "Your son," Collins said suddenly, consulting his own notes. "David Fletcher. There was some kind of legal dispute?" The change in atmosphere was immediate and palpable. Harold's shoulders sagged, and Martha's face crumpled slightly before she regained control. "David made some poor choices," Harold said carefully. "We tried to help, and it cost us everything. But that's a family matter, not a criminal one." Morrison closed his notebook. "Well, if you do see anything unusual, give us a call. These rural areas can be attractive to people looking to conduct business away from prying eyes." "Of course," Martha said. "Though honestly, Sheriff, at our age, we sleep so poorly that we'd probably notice if a mouse changed its routine." The officers moved toward the door, Collins casting one last look at the basement entrance. "You sure about those stairs? We could probably force the door if there's a safety concern." "Appreciate the offer," Harold said, "but we know better than to go down there in the dark. If we need anything, we'll wait for daylight and proper tools." After the patrol car disappeared down the rutted driveway, Martha and Harold stood in their darkened kitchen, listening to the silence that followed the officer's departure. "How long do you think we have?" Martha whispered. Harold checked his watch. "Less time than we hoped. More than we feared." The sirens had faded to distant whispers by the time Martha finished destroying the last of the evidence. Her arthritic fingers worked with surprising efficiency, feeding papers into the wood stove that Harold had installed in their bedroom. Each document curled and blackened, taking with it months of careful planning and decades of suppressed rage. Harold sat on the edge of their bed, watching her work. His breathing had grown more labored in the past week, and she could see the grey pallor creeping across his skin. The cancer was winning its race against time, but they'd accomplished what they set out to do. "The laptop's clean," he wheezed, closing the device with a satisfying click. "Wipe the drives in the basement too. Nothing left but empty shells." Martha fed the last bank routing number into the flames and dusted ash from her hands. Through their bedroom window, she could see flashlight beams dancing across the cornfield, where Deputy Chen was still searching for evidence that would never be found. The young officer had been thorough, she'd give him that, but he was looking for the wrong things in the wrong places. "Do you think Tommy knows yet?" Harold asked. Martha considered this as she settled beside him on the bed. Their son would be waking up in his Scottsdale mansion about now, probably reaching for his phone to check his accounts before his feet hit the marble floor. The routine of a man who measured his worth in numbers on a screen. "The banks don't open for another hour in Arizona," she said, "but the automated systems run all night. If he's checking his portfolio—" She let the sentence hang between them. Harold nodded slowly. 23.7 million. That's what we calculated, wasn't it? 23.8, actually. The cryptocurrency fluctuated overnight. Martha smoothed her nightgown over her knees. "Evelyn Patterson's medical bills are paid in full as of midnight. The Hendersons' farm foreclosure has been reversed. The Kowalski family will find their daughter's college fund mysteriously replenished." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the search outside. Chen's radio crackled with updates from other officers, but Martha caught enough fragments to know they were finding nothing. The basement laboratory was gone, dismantled and carted away in garbage bags over the past 3 days. The sophisticated computer setup had been reduced to a few harmless-looking components scattered throughout the house. "I never thought I'd become a criminal at 78, Harold mused, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Are we criminals, though?" Martha squeezed his fingers gently. "We stole from our son, yes, but Tommy stole from us first, stole our dignity, our security, our golden years, left us to die in poverty while he bought his 3rd vacation home." Harold's chuckle turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, his eyes were bright with something that might have been pride. "You know what I realized, Martha? We raised him wrong. We gave him everything he wanted, never taught him the value of struggle. Maybe this is our chance to finally parent him properly." A knock at their bedroom door interrupted the moment. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan?" Chen's voice was respectful but tired. "I'm sorry to bother you again, but I have a few more questions." "Come in, dear," Martha called, arranging herself into the pose of a confused elderly woman. Chen stepped inside, his uniform rumpled from hours of searching. His notepad was nearly full, but Martha could see the frustration in his expression. "I've finished processing the basement, but I'm having trouble understanding what we found down there. The equipment seems incomplete." "Oh, that's Harold's ham radio setup," Martha said without missing a beat. "He's been trying to contact his brother in Minnesota for years. Never could get the thing working properly, could you, honey?" Harold shook his head weakly. Always was better with my hands than with electronics. Probably wired something backwards. Chen glanced at his notes. The bank reports mentioned sophisticated financial transactions originating from this address, routing through multiple offshore accounts, cryptocurrency exchanges. "I'm afraid you have us confused with someone else, officer," Martha said. "We barely know how to use the microwave, let alone computers. Harold here still thinks ATMs are magic boxes." The deputy's phone buzzed and he glanced at the screen. His expression shifted as he read the message, eyebrows rising slightly. "Ma'am, I just received word that there's been a significant cyber attack on several major financial institutions, millions of dollars transferred to various charitable organizations and individuals. The FBI is taking over the investigation." Martha felt Harold's hand tighten around hers, but her expression remained placidly confused. How terrible, though I suppose if people are giving money to charity, that's not entirely bad, is it? Chen studied their faces for a long moment, then closed his notepad with a snap. "I suppose not, ma'am. Thank you for your cooperation. We'll be in touch if we need anything else." As his footsteps receded down the hallway, Martha and Harold exchanged a look that contained 47 years of marriage, 6 months of planning, and the satisfaction of a job well done. The sheriff's cruiser kicked up dust clouds that hung in the still morning air like smoke signals announcing the end of everything. Martha watched from the kitchen window, her arthritic fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. Harold sat at the table behind her, methodically cleaning his glasses with a threadbare cloth, a nervous habit that had intensified over the past weeks. "How long do you think we have?" she asked, without turning around. "Minutes, maybe an hour if we're lucky." Harold's voice carried the weight of a man who had run out of miracles. "Depends on whether they're just following up on noise complaints or if someone talked." The basement operation had grown beyond their wildest expectations. What started as a desperate attempt to survive their final months had transformed into something that could fund a dozen retirements. The sophisticated setup below their feet hummed with quiet efficiency, a testament to Harold's engineering background and Martha's surprising aptitude for chemistry. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their son Richard's pharmaceutical connections, meant to destroy them, had inadvertently provided the knowledge that saved them. Martha set down her cup and turned to face her husband of 52 years. His hands trembled slightly as he folded the cleaning cloth, and she noticed how his wedding ring had grown loose on his finger. The stress was eating him alive, literally. "We knew this day would come," she said, moving to the basement door. "The question is whether we go down fighting or find another way out." The sheriff's knock echoed through the house before Harold could respond. 3 sharp raps that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards and into the operation below. Martha's hand hovered over the basement light switch. One flip would activate the emergency protocols they'd installed. Everything would be destroyed within minutes, leaving nothing but an old couple and their crumbling farmhouse. "Sheriff's Department," came the voice from outside. "We'd like to speak with you folks about some complaints from neighbors." Martha caught Harold's eye and saw her own thoughts reflected there. Neighbors. The Hendersons lived 2 miles away, and old Pete Morrison was even farther out. Someone had gotten close enough to hear something, which meant their security had been compromised. "Coming," Harold called out, his voice steadier than Martha expected. He stood slowly, favoring his left knee, and smoothed down his flannel shirt. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was supposed to be, a dying old man living out his final days in relative poverty. Martha followed him to the front door, her mind racing through contingencies they'd planned but hoped never to use. The duffel bag hidden in the hall closet contained $40,000 in cash, new identification papers, and enough medication to last them 3 months. The escape route through the backwoods led to a storage unit 20 miles away where Harold had stashed their emergency vehicle, a nondescript Honda that wouldn't draw attention. Harold opened the door to reveal Sheriff Coleman, a man they'd known peripherally for years through town functions and church gatherings. He stood alone, which was either very good news or very bad news depending on his intentions. Morning, folks. Hope I'm not disturbing you too early. Coleman's tone was conversational, but his eyes were already scanning what he could see of the interior. Got a call about some unusual sounds coming from this direction. Heavy machinery, chemical smells. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Heavy machinery? Martha stepped forward, allowing confusion to creep into her voice. Sheriff, do we look like people who could afford heavy machinery? Harold can barely manage the lawnmower anymore. It wasn't entirely a lie. Harold's emphysema had worsened considerably over the past month, and the physical demands of their operation were taking their toll. But necessity had a way of making the impossible seem routine. Coleman's radio crackled to life, and Martha caught fragments of a conversation about backup units and search warrants. Her blood turned to ice water. This wasn't a casual inquiry based on neighbor complaints. Someone had provided specific information about their activities. Mind if I take a look around? Coleman asked, but his hand was already resting on his weapon. Just to put these concerns to rest. Harold stepped aside, gesturing for the sheriff to enter. Of course. Though I should warn you, the basement stairs are pretty rickety. Martha's been after me to fix them for months. As Coleman crossed the threshold, Martha's finger found the light switch. One flip would trigger the destruction sequence, eliminating the evidence but also destroying 6 months of work and their only hope for financial security. She hesitated, watching Harold's face for guidance. The decision, when it came, surprised them both. Harold smiled, actually smiled, and extended his hand to the sheriff. Actually, Coleman, there's something we'd like to show you. Something that might interest a man in your position. The knock came at 4:17 a.m., sharp and deliberate against the warped front door. Martha's eyes snapped open in the darkness, her hand instinctively reaching for Harold's shoulder. But the bed beside her was empty, the sheets cold. She remembered then, he was downstairs running the final calculations. Harold, she whispered into the darkness, but received no response. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Martha slipped her feet into worn slippers and crept to the window. Through the frost-etched glass, she could make out the silhouettes of 2 vehicles, a sedan and what looked like a van. No headlights, but she caught the faint red glow of cigarettes in the darkness. They'd found them. Moving as quietly as her arthritic joints would allow, Martha made her way to the basement door. The familiar hum of equipment grew louder as she descended, and she found Harold exactly where she expected, hunched over the main console, his reading glasses reflecting the glow of multiple monitors. They're here, she said simply. Harold didn't look up from his work. His fingers continued flying across the keyboard with surprising agility for a man his age. How many? At least 2 cars. Could be more. I need 3 more minutes. The knocking above them stopped. In the sudden silence, they both heard the unmistakable sound of a lock being picked. Martha felt her chest tighten, but not with fear, with anger. After everything they'd survived, everything they'd lost, these people thought they could simply walk into their home. Martha. Harold's voice was steady. The red switch. She looked at the emergency panel they'd installed weeks ago. The red switch sat under a clear plastic cover, innocent-looking but devastating in its potential. Not yet. If they make it down here, they won't understand what they're seeing. Give them a chance to leave. Footsteps crossed the floor above. Heavy boots, multiple sets. A muffled voice said something about checking the basement. Harold's fingers never paused. Lines of code scrolled across the screen faster than Martha could follow, but she understood the essence of what he was doing. 6 months of work, compressed and uploaded to servers scattered across the globe. Insurance, Harold called it. Their legacy. The basement door creaked open. Harold Murphy? The voice carried authority and barely concealed excitement. Martha Murphy? This is Agent Chen with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a warrant. Martha stepped forward, positioning herself between the stairs and Harold's workstation. This is our home. You're not welcome here. Ma'am, please step aside. We have reason to believe you're operating an illegal cryptocurrency mining operation. Martha almost laughed. If only it were that simple. You have no idea what you're walking into. 3 figures descended the stairs, flashlight beams cutting through the basement's dim lighting. Martha heard one of them whistle low under his breath as the full scope of their setup became visible. Servers lined every wall, cables snaked across the ceiling like digital ivy, and monitors displayed streams of data that would take experts weeks to decode. "Jesus," one of the agents muttered. "Look at all this equipment. How did 2 senior citizens afford—" "We built it," Harold said, finally looking up from his work. He removed his glasses and cleaned them with methodical precision. Every component, every line of code. "We built it all." Agent Chen stepped closer, his flashlight beam sweeping across the nearest server rack. "Built what exactly? What is all this?" Harold and Martha exchanged a look. In that glance passed 6 months of sleepless nights, of rage transformed into purpose, of 2 people who'd been discarded by the world deciding to remake it. "You wouldn't understand," Martha said. "Try me." Harold saved his work with a final keystroke and stood slowly. "It's justice, Agent Chen. Pure and simple. Justice for what? For every person like us. Every family destroyed by medical debt. Every parent who died because they couldn't afford treatment. Every senior citizen cheated out of their life savings by children who saw dollar signs instead of love." Agent Chen's radio crackled. "Chen, we've got movement on the financial networks. Multiple banks reporting unusual activity." Harold smiled for the first time in months. "Right on schedule. What did you do?" Chen's voice carried a new note of urgency. "We leveled the playing field," Martha said. "Every insurance company that denies legitimate claims, every hospital that price gouges desperate families, every politician who votes against health care while their own family never wants for anything, they're all about to learn what it feels like to lose everything." The radio chattered again, voices overlapping in growing panic. Multiple financial institutions, coordinated attack, billions in transfers. Agent Chen looked between the elderly couple and the humming servers. "You're telling me you 2 orchestrated some kind of massive cyber attack?" Harold reached for Martha's hand. "We prefer to think of it as aggressive accounting correction." Above them, more vehicles were arriving. The laboratory hummed with an energy that seemed to pulse through the very walls. Martha moved between the workstations with practiced efficiency, her arthritis forgotten in the familiar rhythm of precise measurements and careful calculations. Harold sat hunched over the computer terminal, his fingers dancing across the keyboard with surprising agility as lines of code cascaded down the screen. "The latest batch is ready for testing," Martha announced, holding up a vial of clear liquid that caught the fluorescent light. "The protein synthesis markers are exactly where we need them." Harold nodded without looking away from his screen. "Good. I've just finished debugging the delivery mechanism algorithm. We'll be able to target specific cellular structures with 97% accuracy now." 6 months. That's what the doctors had given them both. Harold's pancreatic cancer and Martha's kidney failure were supposed to have claimed them by now, yet here they stood in their underground sanctuary, more alive than they'd felt in decades. The irony wasn't lost on either of them that their greatest scientific breakthrough had emerged from their darkest hour. Martha lifted the vial again, watching the solution catch the light. 23 years of research at the university, countless grant applications denied, their work dismissed as too theoretical by colleagues who couldn't see past traditional treatment models. Now, with nothing left to lose, they'd accomplished what the entire oncology department had deemed impossible. "Do you ever wonder what David would think if he could see this?" Martha asked, setting the vial carefully in its designated spot. Harold's typing paused. Their son's name still carried the weight of fresh betrayal, even after all these months. David made his choice when he chose money over family. This is bigger than his greed. The basement laboratory represented more than scientific achievement. It was their monument to resilience. Every piece of equipment had been carefully selected and purchased with their dwindling resources: the centrifuge, salvaged from a university auction; the microscope, bought second-hand from a retiring researcher; the computer system, assembled from components Harold had bartered for with his old colleagues who still believed in their vision. Martha moved to the far wall where dozens of test results covered every available surface. Charts tracking cellular regeneration rates, protein interaction models, and treatment response curves painted a picture of breakthrough medicine. The progression was unmistakable. Cancer cells not just halted in their growth, but actively converted into healthy tissue. "We need to start documenting everything for the transfer," Harold said, finally turning from his computer. "Dr. Sarah Coleman arrives tomorrow, and she'll need complete data sets to continue the work." The name carried weight between them. Sarah had been Martha's most promising graduate student 15 years ago, before budget cuts forced her into private research. Unlike their other former colleagues, she'd never stopped believing in their unconventional approaches. When Martha had reached out 3 weeks ago, Sarah had agreed to visit without hesitation. "She'll understand the implications immediately," Martha replied. "The cancer applications alone could save millions of lives, but the regenerative properties—" "Harold, we've essentially cracked the code on cellular aging." Harold stood slowly, his body protesting the long hours bent over the keyboard. "Which is why we can't let this work die with us. The pharmaceutical companies would bury it if they knew. Too much profit in treatment to allow actual cures. They'd learned that lesson the hard way during their university years. Research that threatened existing revenue streams had a way of disappearing into regulatory bureaucracy or being discredited through carefully orchestrated peer review assassinations. This time would be different. This time, they controlled the narrative." Martha walked to a secure filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder. "I prepared everything for Sarah: complete methodology, detailed protocols, source code for the delivery algorithms. She'll be able to replicate our results within weeks. And the samples? 12 vials of the refined compound properly stored and labeled. Enough for her to begin human trials once she establishes her own laboratory." The weight of their achievement settled around them like a comfortable blanket. 6 months ago, they'd been broken, bankrupt, and dying. The world had written them off as pathetic casualties of a healthcare system that devoured its most vulnerable citizens. Even their own son had seen them as nothing more than an embarrassing burden. Now they possessed knowledge that could revolutionize human medicine. The compound didn't just treat disease, it restored cellular function to optimal levels, effectively reversing decades of age to related deterioration. Their own improved health stood as living proof of its efficacy. "Tomorrow changes everything," Harold said quietly. Martha nodded, looking around their underground achievement one final time. "Dr. Coleman will ensure this work reaches the right people, the ones who care more about healing than profit margins." The laboratory fell silent except for the gentle hum of equipment maintaining their precious samples. In less than 24 hours, their life's greatest work would begin its journey into the world, carrying with it the potential to redefine what it meant to grow old, to face disease, to hope for more time. The laboratory hummed with an intensity that made the air itself seem alive. Martha's hands moved with practiced precision across the control panel, her arthritic fingers dancing over buttons and dials that would have baffled scientists half her age. The blue glow from the containment chamber cast ethereal shadows across her weathered face as she monitored the readings that defied every known law of physics. "Energy output stable at 847 terawatts," she called to Harold, who stood hunched over a bank of computers, his thick glasses reflecting streams of cascading data, temperature holding steady at -43 degrees. Harold's fingers paused over the keyboard. 847, just like the money we had left when we came here. "Don't get sentimental on me now," Martha replied, though her voice carried a note of wonder. "We're 3 hours from the breakthrough." Above them, the sound of helicopters grew louder. Through the small basement window, searchlights swept across the barren fields, turning the October night into an artificial dawn. The FBI had found them, just as they'd known they eventually would. But timing, as Martha had learned in her 40 years of classified research, was everything. The device at the center of the chamber pulsed with impossible light. No larger than a coffee can, it contained enough clean energy to power half the continent for a decade. The theoretical work had been locked away in government vaults for 30 years, deemed too dangerous, too revolutionary. When Martha had tried to publish even the basic principles, they'd buried her career, stripped her security clearance, and made sure no legitimate institution would touch her. But desperation, she discovered, was the most powerful catalyst of all. "Martha," Harold's voice was tight with concern. "The readings from the quantum field are spiking. We're approaching critical resonance." She glanced at the monitors, her heart racing. This was it, the moment when theoretical physics became tangible reality, the moment when an old woman's revenge against a system that had discarded her would reshape the world's understanding of energy itself. "Let it spike," she said. "The field needs to reach critical mass for the transfer protocol to work." Harold moved to her side, his hand finding hers. "Are you sure about this? Once we activate the global transmission, there's no going back. Every university, every research facility, every basement tinkerer with a decent receiver will have the complete specifications." Martha smiled, remembering the night 6 months ago when they'd first descended into this basement with nothing but their combined knowledge and an unshakable determination to leave something meaningful behind. The walls around them now bore no resemblance to the moldy stone they'd found. Every surface hummed with carefully calibrated equipment, most of it built from components Harold had somehow acquired through contacts Martha suspected she was better off not knowing about. "They threw us away," she said, watching the energy readings climb toward the threshold. "Forced us into bankruptcy defending patents they claimed were national security risks. Let our son steal our life savings while we fought cancer with no insurance. They thought we'd just disappear quietly." The sound of vehicles crunching over gravel announced the arrival of ground forces. Soon they'd have agents surrounding the house, demanding entry, threatening them with federal crimes and domestic terrorism charges. Martha had seen this playbook before, had watched it destroy other researchers who'd gotten too close to revolutionary discoveries. 60 seconds to optimal transmission window," Harold announced, his fingers flying over the final calculations. "The satellite array will be in perfect alignment." Martha moved to a small table where a bottle of champagne sat next to 2 glasses, the last luxury they'd allowed themselves with their dwindling resources. She popped the cork, the sound sharp in the humming laboratory. "To the future," she said, handing Harold a glass. "To the future," he agreed, clinking his glass against hers. Above them, boots thundered across the front porch. Voices shouted commands through megaphones, demanding they exit the building with their hands visible. Martha took a slow sip of champagne, savoring the bubbles on her tongue. 30 seconds, Harold called out. The device in the containment chamber was now pulsing so rapidly it appeared to be a steady column of light. The quantum field readings showed energy patterns that would take the scientific community years to fully understand. But the basic principles would be undeniable. Clean, unlimited energy derived from the zero-point fluctuations of space itself. 10 seconds. A battering ram struck the basement door. Wood splintered, and Martha could hear agents calling for backup, for specialists, for anyone who might understand what they were seeing. 5, 4, 3. Martha raised her champagne glass one final time. 2, 1. Transmission commencing. The device flared brilliant white, and across the world, every radio telescope, every university receiver, every amateur radio enthusiast suddenly found themselves receiving the most important broadcast in human history. The complete, unencrypted specifications for unlimited clean energy released freely into humanity's hands. Martha smiled as the basement door burst open and tactical lights flooded their laboratory. They were too late to stop anything. The sirens grew louder as Martha carefully placed the last component into its padded case. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed this task countless times, though she'd prayed she'd never have to do it under these circumstances. "How long do we have?" Harold asked, sealing another container with methodical calm. 5 minutes, maybe less." Martha's voice carried no panic, only the steady resolve of someone who had accepted what must come next. The motion sensors picked them up at the tree line. They worked in synchronized silence, dismantling 6 months of careful construction. Each piece had been crafted with love and desperation in equal measure, born from the terrible clarity that comes when you have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. The basement that had once hummed with quiet industry now echoed with the hollow sound of dreams being packed away. Harold paused at the workbench, where he'd spent countless hours, his weathered hands running across the scarred wood surface. "You know what this means, don't you? If they find even a trace of what we've done here." "They won't." Martha's certainty surprised even herself. "We've been careful. Every calculation, every component, every safety protocol. We're not the reckless children David thinks we are." The mention of their son's name hung in the air like smoke. David, who had drained their accounts and abandoned them to die slowly in poverty. David, who had never understood that brilliance doesn't fade with age, only focuses like a laser as mortality approaches. David, who would never know what his parents had accomplished in this basement. Martha triggered the final sequence on the hidden panel. The sophisticated equipment they couldn't dismantle in time began its automated shutdown, erasing digital fingerprints and resetting to factory defaults. To any casual inspection, it would appear to be nothing more than an old ham radio setup, the hobby of elderly folks with too much time on their hands. "The documentation?" Harold asked. "Encrypted and uploaded to 7 different servers across 4 continents. The proof exists, even if we don't live to present it ourselves." Martha's smile held secrets that would have astounded the government agencies now surrounding their property. "And the real prototype?" Harold patted his jacket pocket. "Right here. Amazing how something so small can change everything, isn't it?" The basement door rattled under heavy fists. Authoritative voices demanded entry, threats and warrants blending into a cacophony of official importance. Martha and Harold exchanged a look that carried 60 years of marriage, 6 months of desperate work, and an understanding that transcended words. "Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Henderson, federal agents, open this door immediately." Martha smoothed her cardigan and checked her appearance in the small mirror beside the workbench. Amazing how vanity persisted even in moments like these. "How do I look?" "Like a harmless old woman with dangerous secrets." Harold's eyes twinkled with the same mischief that had first attracted her all those decades ago. "Perfect." The basement door splintered open just as they reached the top of the stairs, Martha's arthritis-gnarled hand on the knob. They emerged to find their small farmhouse filled with black-clad figures carrying enough firepower to level a city block. "Step away from the basement. Hands where we can see them." Martha raised her hands with exaggerated care, playing the role of frightened elderly woman with Oscar-worthy skill. "Oh my. Is there some kind of problem, officers?" Agent Sarah Chen pushed through the tactical team, her face a mask of professional skepticism. She was younger than David, probably thought anyone over 70 was automatically confused and helpless. That assumption would serve Martha and Harold well. "Mrs. Henderson, we have credible intelligence that you and your husband have been engaged in activities that pose a significant threat to national security." Harold shuffled forward, playing up his limp. "National security? Ma'am, I think you might have the wrong house. We're just retired folks trying to make ends meet." "Sir, our sources indicate that sophisticated nuclear research has been conducted on this property, research that could potentially be weaponized." The words hung in the air like an accusation and a confession. Martha felt Harold tense beside her, but her own reaction was carefully calibrated surprise mixed with just the right amount of indignation. "Nuclear research? In our basement?" She laughed, the sound brittle and realistic. "Agent Chen, is it? I'm afraid your sources might be having a bit of fun with you. My husband fixes old radios down there. It's hardly Los Alamos." But even as she spoke, Martha could see Chen's eyes cataloguing details, noting the cleanliness of their clothes despite their supposed poverty, the way Harold stood despite his performance of frailty, the faint chemical smell that even their ventilation system couldn't entirely eliminate. They had perhaps minutes before someone smart enough and thorough enough uncovered what they'd really accomplished in those 6 months of desperate brilliance. The FBI van sat in the farmhouse driveway like a mechanical vulture, its satellite array catching the morning light. Martha watched from the kitchen window as Agent Sarah Chen emerged, her phone pressed to her ear. Even from this distance, Martha could read the tension in the younger woman's shoulders. Harold shuffled up behind her, his breathing labored but his eyes sharp. "They've been out there since dawn," he murmured. "Something's changed." Through the thin walls, they could hear muffled conversations, the crackle of radios, the measured footsteps of people who had discovered something that altered everything. Martha's fingers found Harold's hand, their wedding rings clicking softly together, a sound that had comforted them for 53 years. "Mrs. Henley?" Agent Chen's voice carried from the front door. "We need to talk." They made their way to the living room slowly, Harold's cane tapping against the warped floorboards. Chen waited with 2 other agents, her expression unreadable. On the coffee table sat a thick manila folder and what looked like printouts from computer screens. "We've completed our analysis of your basement operation," Chen began, settling into the worn armchair across from them. "The pharmaceutical compounds you've been producing, we've run them through every database we have." Martha felt Harold's hand tighten in hers. They had known this moment would come, had prepared for it in their own quiet way. The question was whether the truth would be better or worse than what people imagined. "The insulin synthesis alone," Chen continued, "represents manufacturing techniques we haven't seen outside of major pharmaceutical companies. The purity levels are actually higher than most commercial products. But that's not what has my superiors making phone calls at 5 in the morning." She opened the folder, revealing pages of chemical formulas and molecular diagrams that Martha and Harold knew by heart. "The cancer treatment compounds. We've had 3 different labs analyze them. The preliminary results are—" Chen paused, searching for words. "Dr. Henley, how long have you been working on these formulations?" Harold cleared his throat, the sound rough with illness and exhaustion. 47 years. He said quietly. "Since Martha's first diagnosis." "The breast cancer," Martha added, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Stage 3. We couldn't afford the treatments, not with Harold still in graduate school. I was supposed to die in 1976. Chen leaned forward. "But you didn't." "Harold wouldn't let me." Martha looked at her husband, seeing past the grey skin and sunken cheeks to the brilliant, desperate young man who had refused to accept the impossible. He'd come home from his lab every night and work in our basement until dawn, trying to find another way. Harold nodded slowly. "Had to be. We couldn't afford patents, couldn't afford clinical trials. Everything had to be off the books, synthesized from materials we could obtain without raising questions." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, the scientist in him emerging despite his fatigue. "Trial and error, mostly on ourselves. Martha volunteered for every test. Because what did I have to lose?" Martha's laugh held no humor. "I was dying anyway. If Harold thought he could save me, I was willing to try anything." Chen flipped through more pages. "Our biochemists are calling some of these formulations revolutionary. The targeted delivery mechanisms, the reduced side effects. This represents decades of research that could change cancer treatment fundamentally." "Could have," Harold corrected. "We're dying, Agent Chen. Everything we learn dies with us." "Not necessarily." Chen exchanged glances with her colleagues. "There are people who want to talk to you. Researchers, oncologists, even pharmaceutical companies. What you've developed here, it could help millions of people." Martha felt something twist in her chest. Hope, maybe, or irony. 47 years too late for that conversation, don't you think? Maybe not. Chen pulled out another document. There are legal protections for research conducted under these circumstances. Patient advocacy groups, medical research foundations. They have resources, lawyers who specialize in situations like this. Harold was shaking his head before she finished. We don't have time for legal battles. 6 months, maybe less. Then we make those 6 months count. Chen's voice carried an intensity that made both Martha and Harold look at her more carefully. My mother died of pancreatic cancer 3 years ago. The treatment's available. They bought her 6 weeks of agony, nothing more. If there's a chance that what you've discovered here could spare other families that kind of suffering. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Outside, more vehicles were arriving. Martha could see news vans setting up across the road, their crews kept at bay by police barriers. The secret they had carried for nearly 5 decades was becoming public property. What happens now? Martha asked. Chen closed the folder carefully. Now we figure out how to turn a basement laboratory into a legacy. The courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Tommy sat slumped in the defendant's chair, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face ashen. The embezzlement conviction carried a 15-year sentence, but Martha knew the real punishment was the look of absolute defeat in her son's eyes when he finally understood what he'd lost. Justice served, Harold whispered, squeezing Martha's weathered hand. She nodded, though the victory felt hollow. They'd won, but at what cost to their family? Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them again. 6 months had passed since the FBI raid on their farmhouse basement, since the discovery that had shocked the pharmaceutical world. The questions came in rapid-fire succession about their revolutionary cancer treatment, about the betrayal by their own son, about their plans for the future. Dr. Sarah Chen appeared at Martha's elbow, gently steering them toward a waiting car. The board meeting is in an hour, she reminded them softly. The formation of the Henderson Medical Foundation had been Swift Pharmaceuticals' idea initially, a way to manage the public relations nightmare of having stolen and shelved a breakthrough treatment. But Martha and Harold had turned it into something else entirely. The foundation's headquarters occupied a restored brownstone in the heart of the city, nothing like the sterile corporate towers they'd once known. Martha walked slowly through the halls, her cane tapping against hardwood floors. The experimental treatment they'd developed in their basement had bought them more time than the original 6-month prognosis, but her body still carried the weight of cancer's siege. In the boardroom, the assembled faces represented everything their old lives had lacked: diversity, hope, genuine purpose. Dr. Chen sat beside Dr. Marcus Webb, the young oncologist who'd first verified their breakthrough. Across the table, patient advocates, community leaders, and researchers who'd committed to making their treatment accessible worldwide. The African Clinic Network is ready to begin Phase 2 trials, Dr. Webb reported, his voice carrying the same excitement Martha remembered from their first successful basement experiment. Kenya, Ghana, and South Africa all confirmed this morning. Harold leaned forward, his engineer's mind still sharp despite everything they'd endured. What about manufacturing costs? We promised this wouldn't become another drug that only the wealthy could afford. $43 per treatment cycle, Dr. Chen announced. Compare that to current options running $30,000 or more. Martha closed her eyes briefly, remembering the crushing weight of those bills, the impossible choices they'd faced. How many families were going through the same devastation right now? How many had already given up? There's something else, Dr. Webb continued, his tone shifting. The Nobel Committee called this morning. The room went quiet. Martha felt Harold's hand find hers under the table, the same way it had in that cramped basement when they'd first realized what they'd discovered. They want to honor your work, Dr. Webb said gently. Both of you. Martha thought about the woman she'd been 18 months ago, broken, defeated, preparing to die in poverty because of her son's greed. That woman never could have imagined this moment. sitting in a room full of brilliant minds committed to healing the world. "The nomination is an honor," Harold said carefully, "but the real prize is in those clinics, in every patient who won't have to choose between treatment and keeping their home." Through the conference room windows, Martha could see the city skyline, the gleaming towers where Tommy had once worked, where they'd once believed success was measured in stock options and corner offices. It all looked so small now, so desperately beside the point. Dr. Chen opened a thick folder. "We have 17 countries requesting partnership agreements. The WHO wants to fast-track approval for emergency use protocols. And there's this." She slid a photograph across the table. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, grinning at the camera from a hospital bed in Mumbai. Priya Sharma, first pediatric patient in the India pilot program. Her tumor shrunk 60% in the first month. Martha picked up the photo with trembling fingers. This was why they'd spent those desperate months mixing compounds in a crumbling basement, why they'd refused to let their discovery die with them. Not for awards or recognition, but for children like Priya, who deserved a chance at tomorrow. The meeting continued around her, discussions of patent sharing, manufacturing partnerships, regulatory hurdles. But Martha found herself thinking about the farmhouse, now empty again, returning to the slow decay they'd interrupted. They'd sold it to fund the foundation's initial operations, but sometimes she dreamed about that basement laboratory, about the hope they'd built in darkness. Harold's voice brought her back to the present. "Martha and I won't live to see the full impact of this work," he was saying, his words steady despite their weight. "But knowing it will continue, knowing it will save lives long after we're gone, that's everything we ever wanted." Outside, winter was giving way to spring. Inside this room, Martha felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not the peace of surrender, but of purpose fulfilled, of love made manifest in healing hands reaching across the world.